you've done is moved a few inches. But some murmur sounds, particularly low-frequency murmur sounds, do not transmit very well. Therefore, you may not hear them, and particularly in the right upper stroke border, most of the time you can't hear microregurgitation at all. Let's see if we can hear it out of the apex. Much louder. In fact, one way you can gauge how bad the mitral regurgitation is to gauge how far it goes. So if you can hear it at the apex, you can hear it in the axilla, you can hear it in the back, underneath the left scapula, that tells you the person has severe mitral regurgitation. And you can see on the little photocardiogram here, this is a pansystolic murmur. It's quite loud. No one here would miss that there's a murmur. I hear these people every day. They're sent to me, and I look at the last note of somebody else that says, no murmur. No murmur. Well, maybe they only listened up here. Okay? I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, no murmur. But you might miss that one. So please, at least, if you're going to listen to an adult patient, listen in the aortic region, which is up high, and then down toward the apex, because you will not be able to hear all these murmurs from any one spot. Now, why do people get mitral regurgitation? Most murmurs that I hear these days are mitral regurgitation, but most of the time it's not prolapse. In a younger person, it would be prolapse, perhaps, but as the population ages, most of the time it's either wear and tear on the valve, calcification of the annulus, or in a heart failure population, as the heart gets larger, the structure of the valve starts to pull apart, and we call that functional mitral regurgitation, and it's the most common reason for regurgitation. It's just the leaflets don't coapt anymore because they've been pulled apart. No different than if you pull the door jamb apart, the door won't work appropriately. So that's the most common reason that we see it these days. Mitral stenosis, we don't see much anymore here. We're looking at the atrium. The blood has to go through. Here's the mitral orifice. And this is all scarred from rheumatic fever. All the blood that would normally flow through this, which is a couple of centimeters, have to flow through this small area about the size of a pencil. And that is classic for mitral stenosis. It's not something we see very much anymore. But here's what it sounds like, just so you can listen to it. Now, the important thing to recognize, this is a diastolic murmur. Systolic murmurs can be normal. Pregnant women, young, 15-year-old kids. Diastolic murmurs are never normal. Never. There is nothing that goes on in the heart that should ever lead to a diastolic murmur unless there's pathology. And here is the classic rumble of mitral stenosis. In fact, there's even an extra sound if you're listening closely, which is the mitral valve opening there. I'm not going to belabor this. You can spend your own time on this because this is something most of you won't be encountering very frequently. Instead, what you're going to hear if you have a geriatric population is aortic valve disease too, right? Because normally the aortic valve lasts about 85 years. And if I went to a nursing home in town and did just listen, 100% of people in their 90s have murmurs. It's just random. And the reason is because the valve becomes thickened, or sclerotic as we call it. And then as that progresses, because once the valve becomes abnormal, believe it or not, bone genes get turned on in the tissues here. So what happens is these humps of calcium are bone. And you can actually look and see that there are osteoblasts in there. This is bone forming in a place that bone should form. So no surprise, if you form bone in these three aortic valve leaflets, that leaflet is not going to work very well. So let's listen to aortic valves, and this is the most common reason to have in the geriatric population, a systolic murmur. Now here we're listening at the apex. If you only put your stethoscope at the apex, here's what you're going to hear. Let's move it up to the aortic area. Same patient, 10 seconds apart. Now, what does that tell me? Well, if I'm listening at the right upper sternal border and I hear this murmur, that's a grade 3 or 4 murmur. And then I move to the apex. Barely hear a murmur. Is this mitral regurg? aortic stenosis or something else that causes an aortic outflow murmur. In a person with this murmur at the right upper sternal border, okay, there are only two things that cause that in the older person. It's either going to be calcific aortic stenosis or it's going to be hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. How do you distinguish the two? You have them stop breathing, tighten up your stomach, and you listen. This murmur, if it goes away during that, it's aortic stenosis. If it gets louder during that maneuver, it's hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So let's turn the murmur off just so that you can instill this in your brain. Now here's the S. Okay. Let's get to that. So again, I would implore you to walk through these because you can put your stethoscope in this computer program in each of these places and listen how the murmur sounds different. But the upper sternum is where you're going to hear the aortic stenosis. Down at the apex is where you're going to hear mitral regurgitation and mitral stenosis if it happens to be. And lastly, let's talk about aortic regurgitation. Okay, let's look at this woman's neck. You see an impulse up here that you would never normally see. Okay? This impulse, however, is a single impulse. Right? So how do I know this isn't jugular? Because it doesn't have an undulatory double contour. So there's something fundamentally wrong with this person. And if you listen, there's a diastolic murmur here. This person has aortic regurgitation. When you hear a diastolic murmur in an adult who hasn't immigrated from some third world country, the vast majority of the time it's aortic regurgitation, right? Because we don't hear mitral stenosis very much anymore in America. But aortic regurgitation, much more commonplace. Here's the murmur. It's very subtle. Right after the second heart sound, you hear a decrescendo murmur, so listen carefully. Let's move our stethoscope and see if we can hear it somewhere else. So here you hear an aortic outflow murmur. You don't really hear diastolic murmur. Let's go to the apex. Outflow, no diastolic. Let's go to the left sternal border. Subtle. Diastolic murmurs are hard to hear. They're the most common murmurs that are missed. But they're the most important because, as I mentioned, they always indicate pathology. Okay. So let's go back to the slides. All of what I just showed you and more is on the website that the Crileys put together for. And this was a teaching tool for the UCLA residents and cardiology fellows. It's open to public use. It's a tremendous resource. Heartsounds.org. So let's go back to our cases. And then we're going to compare your vote. So here's this 23-year-old. Remember her? She's 6 feet tall, volleyball player. She comes in saying, I'm aware of my heartbeat. And you heard a decrescendo diastolic murmur in the left sternal border. You also noticed that her fingers were longer than a normal person. So what do you think the diagnosis is? Choose one of these. Anxiety, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, prolapse, dilated ascending aortic root, or rheumatic heart disease. Please choose one. Okay. So let's look and see what we've heard here. First of all, obviously young people can be anxious. However, anxiety won't cause a murmur, right? It might cause a little outflow murmur if they're tachycardic and hyperthyroid and anxious, like a pregnant woman would have an outflow murmur just due to hyperdynamic flow. But it would never cause a diastolic murmur. A diastolic murmur is between cardiac contraction, right? Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, number 2, is a systolic murmur. So right away, if she has a diastolic